I wanted one night of freedom. At the New Year's Eve gala, a stranger in a mask found me. His words cut sharper than champagne, his kiss left me burning. I never even asked his name. But Monday morning, the courtroom doors opened, and there he was. The judge, my stranger, my secret, and the one man with the power to destroy me. What happens when law and desire collide? For stories of burning desire and unforgettable romance, subscribe today. Don't miss the next chapter of passion. The air in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive New Year's Eve gala crackled with power. It was a room full of sharks, lawyers, financiers, and politicians, all circling, smiling with teeth. For Audrey Sinclair, it was just another Tuesday, but in a ball gown. As one of the city's sharpest rising corporate lawyers, she was here to be seen, to network, but mostly to grant herself one night of escape before the biggest trial of her career began the next morning. She felt his presence before she saw him. It was a sudden shift in the room's gravitational pull, as if everything had tilted slightly in his direction. He was tall, wearing a tuxedo with the kind of effortless perfection that spoke of old money and new power. A simple black mask hid his eyes, but it did nothing to soften the arrogant, intelligent line of his mouth. He stopped beside her at the champagne bar, his shoulder almost brushing hers. "A lawyer who looks that lost in thought on New Year's Eve," he said, his voice a low, velvety rumble that cut through the noise, "is either celebrating a spectacular victory or planning a war." Audrey turned, intrigued. He didn't just see a woman in a dress. He saw her. "Maybe the war has a ceasefire for the holidays," she countered, a ghost of a smile on her lips. His smirk was slow and devastatingly confident. "Wars don't have ceasefires," he murmured, his gaze intense enough to feel like a physical touch. "Only tactical pauses. Tell me, counselor, what are you fighting for?" The banter was intoxicating, a duel of wits between two equals. They didn't exchange names. Names were for the real world, for business cards and court dockets. Tonight, they were just two anonymous forces drawn together by an undeniable magnetic pull. As the countdown to midnight began, he led her from the crowded room into the quiet hush of a darkened library off the main hall. The distant shouts of 3, 2, 1 were a muffled drumbeat. He backed her against a wall of old leather-bound books, caging her in without a single touch. "I've made my decision," he whispered, his voice thick with a desire that mirrored her own. "About what?" she breathed, her heart hammering. "About how I'm starting my new year." His mouth came down on hers not as a question, but as a verdict. It was a kiss that bypassed all logic and went straight to pure, unadulterated want. It was fierce, possessive, and utterly consuming, a clash of two dominant wills finally surrendering to a shared, reckless impulse. When he pulled away, leaving her breathless and clinging to a bookshelf for support, he simply gave her one last, smoldering look and was gone. An anonymous, perfect, and dangerously thrilling memory. The next morning, the memory of the kiss was a secret fire simmering beneath Audrey's skin, but her focus was ice cold. She walked into the federal courthouse, her mind a fortress of legal strategy and ruthless preparation. Today was the culmination of a year's work, the Sterling versus Thorne case. It was a brutal corporate espionage lawsuit, and she was facing off against her professional nemesis, Marcus Thorne, a lawyer whose smarmy ambition was matched only by his willingness to bend the rules. Winning this case wouldn't just be a victory, it would define her career. She took her place at the defense table, giving Marcus a nod of cool acknowledgement. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Audrey felt the familiar thrilling surge of adrenaline. This was her arena. She was ready. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed. The side door opened and the judge entered. He moved with a commanding grace that seemed to suck the very air from the room, his black robes a symbol of absolute power. Audrey's gaze, along with everyone else's, followed him as he ascended to the bench. He sat, arranged a few papers, and then lifted his head, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom. His gaze passed over Marcus Thorne, then landed on her, and the world stopped. It was him, the same arrogant mouth, the same strong, aristocratic jaw. And the eyes, no longer hidden by a mask, were a shade of piercing, intelligent blue that she recognized on a cellular level. The blood drained from her face, and a wave of ice-hot panic washed over her. He was the judge. The man she had kissed with wild abandon was the ultimate authority in the most important case of her life. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. For one heart-stopping, infinite second, his professional mask slipped, and she saw it, a flicker of pure, unadulterated shock, immediately followed by the ghost of that same devastatingly confident smirk from the night before. It was a micro-expression, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a stony, impartial facade. But she had seen it. He remembered everything. And God help her. He looked amused. Judge Alistair Blackwood cleared his throat, the sound a low, resonant rumble that echoed the voice from her memory. He looked directly at her, but his words were for the whole room. The court is now in session. Mr. Thorne, you may begin. The courtroom, once Audrey's arena of control, had suddenly transformed into an alien landscape. The sound of Marcus Thorne clearing his throat to begin his opening statement was a distant, irrelevant noise, like a car alarm down the street. It didn't penetrate the thick, humming silence that had enveloped her. Her entire universe had collapsed into the space between her defense table and the elevated judge's bench. It was a space charged with an invisible high-voltage current, and at its center was him. Judge Alistair Blackwood, Alistair. The name echoed in the private chambers of her mind, a name she hadn't known last night, but felt like she'd known forever. Her heart, that traitorous muscle, hammered against her ribs not with fear, but with a wild, terrifying rhythm of recognition. A cold dread snaked its way up her spine, but it was intertwined with something else, something hot and liquid that pooled low in her stomach. A treacherous thrill. She felt the sudden, desperate need to anchor herself. Her fingers curled around the edge of the polished mahogany table, the wood cool and solid beneath her touch. Her knuckles turned white from the pressure. "Breathe, Sinclair. Just breathe." Marcus Thorne's voice began to slice through her internal chaos. It was an oily, self-satisfied sound, the kind of voice that enjoyed its own echo. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, though there was no jury. A theatrical flourish that made Audrey's lip curl in disdain. "The facts of this case are as simple as they are egregious. My client, Sterling Industries, was the victim of a calculated, predatory act of corporate espionage, a hostile takeover of their most valuable proprietary asset. Hostile takeover. Proprietary asset. The legal terms, usually her weapons, were now being turned against her in a secret personal war. Her gaze remained locked on Alistair. He wasn't looking at her. His attention seemed to be entirely on Marcus, his posture a study in judicial neutrality. His fingers were steepled before him, his face an unreadable mask of stone. But she could see things others wouldn't. She saw the absolute, almost unnatural stillness of his body, a sign of a man exerting immense self-control. She saw the faint, tight line of his jaw beneath the patrician skin. He was a fortress, but she knew intimately the fire that burned within its walls. Marcus droned on, outlining the supposed theft of intellectual property. Audrey forced herself to listen, to re-engage her lawyer's brain. She had to compartmentalize. The man on the bench was not the man from the library. The man on the bench was her opponent's greatest advantage. A judge known for his sharp intellect and his intolerance for anything less than perfect legal reasoning. She had to be better than perfect. She had to be flawless. The memory of his lips on hers, the ghost of his taste, whiskey and pure, undiluted confidence, was a dangerous distraction she had to bury. She repeated it to herself like a mantra. He is the judge, nothing more. A lie, and her body knew it was a lie. A faint, treacherous heat was creeping up her neck. A blush she prayed the courtroom's dim lighting would hide. "A blatant act of theft designed to cripple my client," Marcus was saying, his voice rising with false indignation. He gestured toward Audrey. "An act orchestrated by a firm that has shown a pattern of aggressive, borderline unethical ambition." Audrey didn't flinch. She simply made a note on her legal pad, her hand steady despite the storm raging inside her. The pen felt slick in her suddenly clammy palm. She could feel Alistair's eyes on her now. It wasn't a direct gaze, but a palpable weight, a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. He was watching her reaction, testing her. Finally, Marcus concluded his self-aggrandizing speech and sat down, looking as pleased with himself as a cat that had just swallowed a canary. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. "Miss Sinclair," Alistair's voice boomed, and the sound of it so formal and deep vibrated through the wooden floor, up her chair, and into her bones. "Your opening statement," this was it. The moment of truth. She pushed her chair back, the sound a sharp scrape against the floor. She stood, her movements measured and deliberate. She smoothed down the front of her tailored jacket, a small, unnecessary gesture that bought her a precious second to fortify her defenses. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, but the only gaze that mattered was the one coming from the bench. She lifted her chin and met it. For a heartbeat, the courtroom disappeared again. It was just the two of them. She saw a flicker in his blue eyes, a glint of something that was not judicial. It was a challenge. "Show me what you've got, counselor." A spark of her own fire ignited, burning away the last wisps of her panic. "How she would show him, Your Honor," she began, her voice a calm, cool counterpoint to Marcus's theatrics. "Mr. Thorne has painted a dramatic picture of theft and hostility, a narrative of a predator and its victim." She paused, letting her eyes sweep over Marcus, who was already looking irritated. "But this narrative is a work of fiction. The truth is far less scandalous, but infinitely more interesting. This isn't a case of a hostile takeover. It's a case of a willing, and I might even say enthusiastic, mutual transaction." The air in the room changed. Her words were perfectly legal, but the double meaning was a grenade she had just rolled softly toward the bench. She saw his fingers, which had been perfectly steepled, pressed together, the tips whitening. A direct hit. She began to walk slowly in front of the defense table, taking command of the space, of the narrative. "Mr. Thorne speaks of a proprietary asset, as if it were a static object locked away in a vault. But the asset in question is dynamic, complex. Its value is not in its mere possession, but in its potential. And potential, Your Honor, is only unlocked under the right circumstances with the right partner." Her gaze flickered to Alistair. He was watching her with an unnerving intensity, his face still a mask, but his eyes were blazing. "The fortress was showing cracks of fire. What my client did was not theft," she continued, her voice dropping, becoming more intimate, drawing everyone in. "It was a recognition of that potential. It was an invitation, an agreement entered into in good faith, based on a clear and undeniable chemistry of interests." "Objection," Marcus snapped, jumping to his feet. "Counsel is characterizing the event with emotionally manipulative language." "Chemistry? This is a courtroom, not a dating seminar." Audrey stopped and turned to the bench, a calm, questioning look on her face. "Your move, Judge." Alistair looked from Marcus to Audrey. The silence stretched thick and heavy. He held their fates and the fate of this secret duel in his hand. "The objection," he said slowly, his voice a deep, deliberate rumble, "is noted." He did not rule on it. He simply acknowledged it, a masterful stroke of judicial ambiguity. Then his gaze settled back on Audrey. "However, I will allow Miss Sinclair to continue her line of reasoning. I am intrigued to see where this chemistry of interests leads us, but do try to remain grounded in the facts, Counselor." The way he said counselor was a caress and a warning. It was a verbal stroking of her hair, while reminding her he held the gavel. He was playing the game right back at her, and he was better at it than she could ever be. He was using the full weight of his authority as his side of the flirtation. Audrey gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course, Your Honor." She returned to her core argument, weaving the facts of the case into her narrative of mutual interest. But the subtext was now a roaring bonfire that only the two of them could feel. Every mention of due diligence was a reference to their sizing each other up at the party. Every argument about contractual understanding was a debate about the nature of their kiss. She was in the middle of a sentence about risk assessment when he cut her off. "Miss Sinclair," he interjected, his voice sharp. "Let's be clear on a specific point. Regarding the initial engagement, was there any ambiguity, any moment of hesitation from either party that could be misconstrued?" He was asking her if she had hesitated before she kissed him, if she had had any second thoughts. The question was so personal, so brazen, wrapped in the thinnest veil of legal relevance that it stole her breath. She felt the blood pounding in her ears. The room was too hot. Marcus was staring at her, his brows furrowed in confusion, sensing he was missing something crucial. She met Alistair's gaze directly. She would not back down. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. There was no ambiguity. The engagement was entered into with absolute certainty. It was decisive and entirely mutual. A shadow of a smile, a dark, dangerous thing touched Alistair's lips before it vanished. He had gotten his answer. He leaned back in his chair, a king on his throne, satisfied. "Very well, Miss Sinclair. You may proceed." But she couldn't. The intensity of the exchange had left her shaken. The room felt like it was closing in. The duel was more exhilarating and more terrifying than she could have imagined. She saw the rest of her morning stretching out before her, a tightrope walk over a canyon of fire, with him on one side and her entire career on the other. And the only thing she could think was, "I can't wait to see what he does next." The moment Audrey finished speaking, a collective, almost imperceptible exhale seemed to sweep through the courtroom. The air, once crackling with tension, became heavy, thick with the aftermath. She remained standing for a beat longer, her body a rigid pillar of defiance, before the adrenaline that had held her ramrod straight began to drain away, leaving a hollow, trembling sensation in its wake. Her knees felt weak, and she sank into her chair, the movement stiff and unnatural. Her gaze slid away from the judge's bench, unable to withstand the searing intensity of his eyes any longer. It was too much. The duel had taken its toll. What in God's name was I thinking? The thought screamed through her mind. That wasn't a legal argument. It was a tightrope walk without a net, a reckless gamble with her entire professional future. He was aflame, and she, like a moth, had danced closer and closer. Mesmerized by the danger, intoxicated by the heat, she could feel the lingering burn now, a deep thrumming beneath her skin that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. She risked a glance at her opponent. She saw Marcus Thorne across the room, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He was shuffling his papers with short, violent movements, his knuckles white. He didn't understand what had just happened, not truly, but his instincts told him he had been outmaneuvered in a game he didn't even know he was playing. His confusion only fueled his rage. Her eyes were drawn against her will back to the bench. Alistair was no longer looking at her. His gaze was fixed on some distant point at the back of the courtroom, but his focus was clearly internal. She saw the muscle in his jaw clench, a single hard spasm that betrayed the iron control he was exerting. He had instigated their duel, had met her every move with a masterful counter, but the game had clearly affected him as well. He was not an impassive god on a throne. He was a man who had been provoked, a man who was now wrestling with the consequences. He picked up his gavel. The dark, polished wood looked unnervingly solid in his hand. Audrey felt her stomach plummet. This was it. He would rule against Marcus's objection or for it. He would side with her, exposing his bias, or he would side against her, punishing her for her audacity. There was no safe path forward. She had forced his hand. He didn't look at either of them. He brought the gavel down with a sharp, definitive crack that echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. The sound made her flinch. "The court will recess for 1 hour," he announced, his voice a low, gravelly sound, stripped of its earlier warmth and playfulness. It was the voice of a man pushed to his limit. Without another word, he stood abruptly. The motion a swirl of black robes and turned, disappearing through the private door behind his bench before anyone could fully process the command. He hadn't ruled on the objection. He had fled. The realization hit Audrey with the force of a physical blow. He had lost control of the proceedings, of the situation, of himself, and had called a halt before the entire charade imploded. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, the courtroom erupted in a low murmur of confused whispers. Marcus was on his feet, sputtering to his junior associate. Audrey didn't wait to hear it. She needed air. She needed to escape. She gathered her files with clumsy, shaking hands, stuffing them into her briefcase without any sense of order. She had to get out of that room, away from the lingering scent of ozone from their electrical storm. She pushed past the bar, her heels clicking a frantic, desperate rhythm on the marble floor. She didn't look at anyone, her eyes fixed on the large double doors at the back of the courtroom. Freedom was just on the other side. She burst through them into the relative quiet of the main corridor. The air here was cooler, tinged with the sterile, lemon-scented polish the cleaning crews used at night. She leaned against the cool marble wall, pressing her forehead against its unyielding surface, letting the chill seep into her heated skin. She closed her eyes, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind of legal statutes, and the memory of blue eyes blazing with something that had nothing to do with the law. She had to get a grip. She was a professional. She had a case to win, but the professional part of her brain felt like it had been hijacked by a more primal, reckless force. The memory of his voice, his scent in the library, the possessive pressure of his mouth on hers, it was all mixing with the proceedings of the morning, creating a dangerous, intoxicating cocktail that was clouding her judgment. Sinclair. The voice was a low growl. Right behind her, her eyes snapped open. Her entire body went rigid. It couldn't be. He should be in his chambers, cooling off, fortifying his defenses. He shouldn't be here. Not now. Slowly she turned. He was standing there, blocking her path of retreat. He had shed his robes, and in the simple but exquisitely tailored dark suit, he looked less like a judge and more like what he was, a predator who had just cornered his prey. The harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor carved sharp, unforgiving lines onto his face. The judicial mask was gone. In its place was a raw, unfiltered expression of fury and something else, something that looked unnervingly like hunger. "Your Honor," she managed to say, her voice a reedy whisper that shamed her. "Don't," he bit out, taking a single predatory step that closed half the distance between them. "Do not hide behind formalities, not after what you just did in there." The accusation, the sheer injustice of it, ignited a spark of her own anger. "What I did?" She shot back, her voice gaining strength. "You were the one asking the questions. I was simply arguing my case, arguing your case." A dark, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "You were setting my courtroom on fire, and you damn well know it. You were using my own rules against me, turning my words, turning us into a spectacle." He took another step. He was so close now she could see the pulse beating a frantic rhythm at the base of his throat. His scent hit her, bergamot, old books, and something clean and male that was uniquely him. It was the scent from the library, a scent of sin and secrets, and it had no place in this sterile courthouse hallway. "You enjoyed it," she whispered. The words an accusation, a truth she saw in his eyes. His control, so absolute on the bench, was fraying at the edges, and the sight was both terrifying and intoxicating. "Enjoyment has nothing to do with it," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "This is about my career. My entire life is built on a foundation of impartiality and control. A foundation you are deliberately trying to shatter with every double entendre and every look you throw my way." He was right in front of her now, his body caging her against the marble wall, just as he had in the library. The heat radiating from him was immense. He leaned in, placing one hand on the wall beside her head. His arm a bar she could not escape. "Let me make something perfectly clear, counselor," he murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate level. His breath, warm and laced with the scent of coffee, ghosted across her cheek. "I am the judge. In my world, I make the rules. I set the terms. And what happened last night was a reckless, inexplicable, and profound mistake. One that will not be repeated." His words were a slap, a cold dousing of water. Humiliation washed over her. He was putting her back in her place. She was just a mistake, a problem to be managed. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how much his words had cut her. "Then I suggest you get out of my way, Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "so I can get back to winning the case you're presiding over." She tried to pass, but he stepped into her path, breath unsteady. His nearness was overwhelming, branding her through the thin fabric of her jacket. A jolt, hot and electric, shot through her at the contact. "Not yet," he growled, his face inches from hers. His eyes, stormy and dark, bored into hers. "You don't get to light a fuse and then walk away from the explosion." His gaze dropped to her mouth, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to kiss her again. Right there in the open hallway, the thought sent a jolt of pure, illicit desire through her, so strong it made her dizzy. He saw it. He saw the flicker of want in her eyes, the slight parting of her lips. A low curse rumbled in his chest. He released her arm as if he'd been burned and took a step back, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it for the first time. He looked like a man at war with himself. "This," he said, his voice ragged, "is not over." He pointed a rigid finger down the hall. "My chambers now. We are going to finish this conversation where there are no witnesses." It wasn't a request. It was a verdict. And as he turned and strode away without looking back, leaving her trembling against the wall, Audrey knew with a terrifying certainty that she was about to face a judgment that had nothing to do with the law. The walk to his chambers was the longest 10 yards of Audrey's life. Each click of her heels on the polished marble floor was a countdown, a drumbeat marking her march toward an unknown fate. The courthouse corridor, usually a space of purpose and order, felt like a surreal, dreamlike tunnel. The air was thin, hard to draw into her lungs. She could feel the blood pulsing in her veins, a frantic, humming rhythm that was a mix of pure, unadulterated fear and a dark, thrilling anticipation. Her mind, her sharp lawyer's mind, was a useless bystander, screaming warnings that her body refused to hear. Turn around, walk away. This is career suicide. But her feet kept moving. Drawn forward by his invisible, irresistible command, he was waiting for her, holding the heavy oak door to his chambers open. He didn't look at her as she approached. His gaze was fixed on the far end of the empty corridor, a sentinel guarding against any possible intrusion. The rigid set of his shoulders, the hard line of his jaw. It was the posture of a man bracing for impact. As she slipped past him into the room, she caught his scent again. A dizzying wave of bergamot and something clean, like fresh linen. A scent that was both intensely personal and utterly out of place. It was the scent of the man, not the judge. The door clicked shut behind her. The sound was a detonation in the heavy silence. It was a seal being placed on the world outside, severing them from the rules, the roles, the charade they were forced to play. The room was just as she'd imagined it would be, a bastion of masculine power. Walls of dark, imposing law books rose to the ceiling, their leather spines like silent, judging witnesses. A massive mahogany desk, clear of any clutter, dominated the space, a testament to a mind that demanded order. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, clean scent of his cologne. It was a cage, a beautiful, opulent cage, and the lion was now circling. He didn't speak. He moved to the center of the room, slowly shrugging out of his suit jacket. The movement was deliberate, controlled, yet it felt like an act of profound intimacy, like the shedding of a layer of armor. He tossed the jacket onto one of the plush leather chairs with a casual disregard that seemed to scream his frustration. He was left in a crisp white shirt, the fine cotton pulling taut across his broad shoulders and chest. He undid his tie with a single sharp tug and loosened the top button of his collar, exposing the strong column of his throat. Every gesture was a silent declaration. The judge is gone. Alistair is here. Audrey stood rooted to the spot just inside the door, her briefcase still clutched in her hand like a shield. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It was a silence filled with everything they hadn't said, every forbidden thought, every jolt of illicit electricity that had passed between them. Finally, he turned to face her. His eyes, a shade of blue so deep they were almost black in the room's dim light, burned into her. The fire she had seen on the bench was now an uncontrolled inferno. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to me?" he asked, his voice a low, rough growl that was barely a whisper, but carried the force of a physical blow. The question was so raw, so stripped of pretense, it disarmed her. "I'm doing my job," she retorted, the words sounding weak and hollow even to her own ears. "No," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "Your job is to argue the law. What you are doing is a targeted, systematic dismantling of my self-control. Every word you chose in that courtroom was a stone aimed directly at the glass house of my composure." Another step. The plush Persian rug muffled his footsteps, making him seem to glide toward her, a predator in his own domain. "You speak of enthusiastic mutual transactions and a chemistry of interests while looking me straight in the eye," he continued, his voice a venomous, seductive purr. "You knew I couldn't react. You knew I was bound by my position, chained to that bench. You used my own courtroom as your personal playground, and you used me as your unwilling plaything." He was in front of her now, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The sheer size of him, the heat rolling off his body in waves, was overwhelming. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the dark stubble shadowing his jaw that hadn't been there the night before. She could see the war raging within him. "You kissed me first," she whispered, the words a desperate, foolish defense. A dark, dangerous smile touched his lips, a smile that held no humor, only a raw, predatory promise. "A fact I have been cursing since I woke up this morning," he murmured. "A moment of insanity that has now bled into every corner of my life. A fire I started, yes. But you, counselor," he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near-inaudible whisper that brushed against her ear. "Are the one who has been pouring gasoline on it." His hand came up, not to touch her but to brace the wall behind her head, his arm a bar across her last avenue of escape. His other hand went to the briefcase she was still clutching, his fingers wrapping around hers, prying the handle from her death grip. He took the case and dropped it to the floor with a soft, dismissive thud. Her last shield was gone. "This," he said, his eyes blazing, "is not about the law. This is not about your client or my reputation. This is about contempt of court. Your contempt for the rules. Your contempt for the danger you're putting us both in." His gaze dropped to her mouth. She saw his throat work as he swallowed, a flicker of vulnerability in his armor of fury. "Hand my contempt," he breathed, the words a rough, pained confession, "for my own damnable weakness when I'm anywhere near you." And that was it. The last thread of his control snapped. His mouth came down on hers, and it was nothing like the kiss in the library. That kiss had been a question, a discovery. This wasn't a question. It was surrender. Two wills colliding until it became hunger. His lips were hard, demanding, trying to brand her with his frustration, to erase the memory of her defiance with the force of his desire. One of his hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head back, deepening the kiss until she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. A small broken sound escaped her throat, a mix of protest and surrender. And that sound, that tiny sign of her submission, changed everything. The anger in the kiss dissolved, replaced by a wave of pure, undiluted hunger. The kiss softened, becoming a slow, searing exploration. He was no longer punishing her. He was memorizing her, tasting the memory of her bold words on her lips, answering her challenge with a language that had no room for misinterpretation. Her hands, which had been pressed uselessly against his chest, slid upward, her fingers curling into the fine fabric of his shirt, clinging to him as the world tilted on its axis. She was kissing him back with a ferocity that matched his own, a silent confession that she had wanted this, provoked this, craved this since the moment she saw him walk into that courtroom. He groaned, a low guttural sound of surrender, and his hand left the wall, his arm wrapping around her waist, lifting her, pressing her body flush against his, until there was no space, no air, no separation between them. She could feel the hard, frantic beat of his heart against her own, the solid wall of his chest, the strength in the arm that held her as if he would never let her go. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged and harsh in the silent room. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of exquisite torture. "This is madness," he rasped, the words a condemnation of them both. "I know," she breathed, her own voice unsteady. "I should throw you out of my chambers," he said, his voice rough. "I should have my clerk call security. I should recuse myself from this case and never see you again." His eyes opened, and the raw, unshielded desire in them stole the air from her lungs. "But I'm not going to," he murmured, his thumb gently stroking her swollen lower lip. "God help me, I'm not." His mouth found hers again, and this time there was no anger, no punishment. There was only the terrifying, exhilarating, and undeniable truth of their shared, reckless desire. And in the hallowed, silent chambers of the law, Audrey knew she had just been sentenced to a lifetime of it. Time seemed to fracture and fall away in the silent, hallowed space of Alistair's chambers. The world outside, the bustling courthouse, the ticking clock of the recess, the career-defining case waiting in limbo, was a distant, muffled echo from another lifetime. The only reality was the solid warmth of his body pressed against hers, the faint, clean scent of his skin, and the lingering taste of him on her tongue, a potent cocktail of strong coffee and raw, undiluted want. Her mind, usually a fortress of logic and precedent, was a beautiful, smoking ruin. There was no thought, only feeling. A deep, resonant hum of connection pulsed between them, a current that had finally found its circuit. He was the first to pull away. The movement was slow, agonizingly reluctant, as if breaking a physical bond that cost him something vital. The loss of his heat was immediate, leaving her feeling suddenly cold and exposed, the cool air of the room a shock against her heated skin. She kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, trying to brand the memory of his closeness onto her soul. When she opened them, he had taken 2 steps back, creating a chasm of space between them. He stood near the edge of his massive desk, not looking at her, but staring down at his own hands as if he didn't recognize them, as if they were the hands of a stranger who had just committed a profound and reckless act. Audrey's own body felt foreign to her. Her legs trembled, and she kept one hand braced against the heavy oak door for support. Her lips felt swollen, sensitive, still tingling with the ghost of his kiss. She watched him, waiting. The silence was different now. It was no longer the charged pre-detonation silence of before. This was the quiet of the aftermath, the heavy, ringing silence after an explosion, when you are left to survey the wreckage and count the cost. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. The fire in them had banked, replaced by a deep, turbulent storm of conflicted emotions. She saw the raw desire still there, but now it was warring with the cold, hard reality of who he was, the judge. She could almost see the weight of his name, his position, his entire life of discipline and control, settling back onto his shoulders. "We can't," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp, the words seeming to tear their way out of his throat. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "We can't do this. We can't be this." The unspoken words hung between them, a truth as solid and unforgiving as the law books lining his walls. A bitter, cold wave of reality washed over Audrey, extinguishing the last embers of the fire he had ignited. Of course they couldn't. He was a federal judge. She was a lawyer arguing a case in his court. What had just transpired wasn't the beginning of something. It was a spectacular, self-immolating end. Humiliation, sharp and hot, pricked at her eyes. She had let this happen. She had provoked him, had met his fire with her own, and now she was left to be scorched by the consequences while he retreated back into his fortress of judicial immunity. She straightened up, pulling the tattered remnants of her professional dignity around her like a shield. "You're right, Your Honor," she said, her voice clipped and cool, a shocking contrast to the intimacy of moments before. Using his title was a deliberate act, an attempt to rebuild the wall between them brick by painful brick. This was a lapse in judgment, for both of us. It won't happen again. She bent to retrieve her briefcase from the floor, the movement a clear signal of her intent to flee. She needed to escape this room, to escape him, to escape the suffocating evidence of her own recklessness. "Stop," he commanded. The word was not loud, but it carried the full weight of his authority, an invisible hand that halted her in her tracks. She froze, her back to him, her hand hovering over the handle of her case. "Don't," he said, his voice softer now, laced with a frustration that wasn't directed at her, but at the impossibility of their situation. "Don't do that. Don't retreat behind that professional wall, not now. It's too late for that." She turned slowly to face him. He had moved away from the desk and was now standing by a small, discreet bar tucked into a corner of the bookshelf. He opened a crystal decanter, the soft clink of the stopper against the glass a sharp sound in the quiet room. He poured a measure of amber liquid, whiskey she presumed, into 2 heavy glasses. The act was so mundane, so normal, it felt utterly surreal. "I'm going to recuse myself from your case," he stated, his back still to her. It was a simple statement of fact, but it landed with the finality of a gavel. "First thing in the morning, I'll notify both parties. The case will be reassigned. You and I will not face each other in that courtroom again." A strange, hollow feeling opened in her chest. It was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. So why did it feel like a loss? Why did the thought of never seeing him on that bench, of never engaging in their dangerous secret duel again, feel like a kind of death? He turned, holding one of the glasses out to her. His face was a mask of calm control, but his eyes told a different story. They were dark, intense, and they held a silent plea. "Don't run from me." She hesitated for a long moment, her mind screaming at her to refuse to walk out that door and save what little was left of her professional sanity. But her body moved of its own accord, her feet carrying her across the Persian rug until she was standing before him. She took the glass, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was a jolt, a searing reminder of the fire that still simmered just beneath the surface. "This is not a lapse in judgment." "Audrey," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur as he watched her over the rim of his own glass. "A lapse in judgment is forgetting to file a motion on time. This," he paused, searching for the right word, "this is a hostile takeover of my logic, of my reason, of every rule I have ever lived by." He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. The intensity of his gaze made her feel stripped bare, as if he could see straight into her soul, and recognized the same chaotic, thrilling surrender she saw in him. Recusing myself from the case solves the legal problem, he continued, placing his glass on the polished surface of the bar. But it does not solve our problem. And what is our problem? She whispered, the whiskey glass feeling impossibly heavy in her trembling hand. He closed the small distance between them, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in the deep blue of his eyes. Our problem, he said, his voice a rough caress, is that what happened in this room was not the end of something. It was the beginning, and we both know it. He reached out, his fingers gently taking the glass from her hand and placing it beside his. His hands came up to cup her face, his touch surprisingly gentle, reverent. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones, a soothing, hypnotic motion. I cannot be your judge, Audrey, he murmured, his gaze holding hers captive. But that does not mean I will not see you again. That is not a term I am willing to accept. It was a declaration of intent, a laying down of new, far more dangerous terms. He was surrendering his judicial power over her, only to assert a different, more personal, and infinitely more potent kind of power. What are you saying? She breathed, though she already knew. I'm saying the case is over, he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. The duel in the courtroom is over. But the war has just moved to a different battlefield. He didn't kiss her again. It was a deliberate act of restraint, a testament to the control he was fighting so hard to regain. It was also a masterful move in their new game, leaving her aching, wanting completely at his mercy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. It was thick, cream-colored stock, with only a name, Alistair Blackwood, and a 10-digit number. No title, no firm, no address. His private number. He pressed the card into her palm, his fingers closing around hers for a brief, warm moment. When you've decided what your opening move is on this new battlefield, he said, his voice a low, seductive challenge, you know how to reach me. And with that he stepped back, creating a space she knew was her cue to fill by leaving. He had surrendered, but he had also won. He had rewritten all the rules and left the next move entirely up to her. As she turned and walked toward the door, the small, rectangular card felt like it was burning a hole in her hand, a tangible symbol of her own impending and now entirely willing surrender. Audrey walked out of Alistair's chambers and back into a world that no longer made sense. The courthouse corridor, with its harsh fluorescent lighting and the distant, mundane echo of a ringing telephone, felt like a scene from a poorly directed play. The colors were too bright, the sounds too loud. Her own body felt disconnected, an automaton moving on autopilot, while her mind was still trapped in the heavy, whiskey-scented silence of his room. Her hand, the one that clutched his business card, was shoved deep into the pocket of her suit jacket, but she could still feel the phantom heat of it, the crisp, sharp edges of the card pressing into her palm like a stigmata. When you've decided what your opening move is on this new battlefield, his words echoed in her ears, a seductive, terrifying challenge. A battlefield. That's what he had called it. And he was right. The very air she breathed now felt charged with the promise of a glorious, devastating conflict. She somehow made it back to the defense table. The courtroom was still mostly empty, a ghost of its former tension. Her junior associate, a bright young lawyer named Ben, looked up at her with wide, concerned eyes. "Are you okay, Audrey?" he asked, his voice a low, respectful murmur. "You were gone for a while. Everyone's talking." Judge Blackwood recusing himself mid-hearing. "It's unheard of." Audrey could only manage a nod, the muscles in her neck feeling tight and stiff. She couldn't form words. What could she possibly say? "Oh, I was just being kissed into oblivion by the judge, who then declared war on my sanity. How was your recess?" The absurdity of it was a hysterical laugh, bubbling just beneath the surface of her carefully constructed composure. She gathered her remaining files, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "I'm fine," she lied, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Just a procedural complication. Let's get back to the office. We need to prepare for a new judge." The entire walk back to her firm, the short taxi ride through the gridlocked arteries of the city, was a blur. The familiar sights of the urban landscape, the steam rising from a manhole cover, the flash of a yellow cab, the towering glass and steel skyscrapers, seemed foreign, like images seen through a distorted lens. Her mind was a courtroom of its own, with warring factions of reason and desire. Reason was the lead prosecutor, presenting a damning case. It laid out the evidence with cold, brutal clarity. Alistair Blackwood was a federal judge. Contacting him outside of a professional capacity was not just unethical. It was an explosive act of self-sabotage. He held a position of immense public trust. An affair with a lawyer who had just appeared before him could end his career, tarnish his family's name, and cause a scandal of epic proportions. She, Audrey Sinclair, would be branded as the ambitious, manipulative seductress who brought down a great man. Her reputation would be in ashes. Every victory she had ever earned would be re-examined, tainted by the suspicion that she had used something other than her intellect to win. Calling that number was professional suicide. Then Desire took the stand. Its argument was not logical. It had no evidence, no statutes, no precedent. It had only one exhibit: the memory of him. The memory of the raw, unshielded want in his eyes. The memory of his voice, a low, rough murmur against her skin, confessing his weakness for her. The memory of the possessive, claiming force of his mouth on hers. A kiss that had felt less like a choice and more like a destiny. Desire argued that a life lived within the safe, sterile lines of professional conduct was not a life at all. It was a long, slow death. What was the point of building a career, a reputation, a fortress of success, if she was to be its sole lonely occupant? He had seen her, truly seen her, in a way no other man ever had. He hadn't seen the lawyer. He had seen the fire. Calling that number was not a risk. It was the only way to truly feel alive. Back in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of her corner office, she stood staring out the floor-to-ceiling window at the sprawling city below. From this height, the chaotic energy of the streets was reduced to an orderly, silent pattern. It was a view she had worked her entire life to earn, a symbol of her control, her ambition. But it felt empty. The victory she sought in the Sterling versus Thorne case now seemed like a hollow prize. The thrill of the courtroom, the intellectual combat, it all paled in comparison to the terrifying, exhilarating duel she had just fought in Alistair's chambers. She slid her hand into her pocket, her fingers closing around the thick, expensive cardstock. She pulled it out. The card was stark, simple, and impossibly elegant. Alistair Blackwood. Just a name. A name that now held more power over her than any legal argument ever could. She sank into the plush leather of her office chair, the cool material a stark contrast to her heated skin. She laid the card on the polished surface of her desk. It sat there, a white rectangle of pure potential, a doorway to a world of unknown consequences. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the colors of a beautiful bruise. Her office filled with shadows, the war in her mind raged on. Don't do it. You're a lawyer. You know the rules. But then she remembered the look on his face as he'd said it. A hostile takeover. Of my logic. Of my reason. He had surrendered his control to her. He had handed her the weapon of his own weakness and dared her to use it. It was the most terrifying and seductive power she had ever been given. Reason had no more arguments. Desire had won. With a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, she reached for her phone. Her fingers felt numb, disconnected from her brain as she tapped the 10 digits into the screen. Each number was a step off a cliff. She pressed the final digit, and a profound ringing silence filled her ears. She lifted the phone, the cool glass pressing against her cheek. She didn't know what she would say. She had no plan, no strategy. For the first time in her life, Audrey Sinclair was acting purely on impulse. The phone rang once, a deep, resonant sound that echoed the pounding of her own heart. It rang a second time. A wave of pure panic washed over her. Hang up now before it's too late. Her thumb hovered over the red icon on the screen, and then the ringing stopped. There was a click. A beat of silent, charged air, and then his voice. Not the booming, authoritative voice of the judge. Not the angry, frustrated growl from the hallway. It was a low, quiet sound, laced with a tension that mirrored her own. It was the voice of the man who had been waiting for her call. I was wondering when you'd make your appeal, Counselor. His voice, a low, velvety rumble on the other end of the line, was a lit match dropped into the dry tinder of her resolve. Audrey's carefully constructed composure, the icy calm she had fought so hard to regain, evaporated in an instant. Her breath caught in her throat, a small hitched sound she prayed he hadn't heard. His words weren't just a greeting. They were an immediate acknowledgement of their secret game, a shared intimate joke that belonged only to them. He hadn't been waiting to see if she would call. He had been waiting to see when. The arrogance of it, the sheer unadulterated confidence should have infuriated her. Instead, a slow liquid heat uncurled deep within her, a treacherous and undeniable response to his power. "I wasn't sure I should," she managed to say, her voice a reedy whisper that was a pathetic shadow of the confident lawyer who had commanded a courtroom just hours before. A low, soft chuckle came through the phone, a sound so unexpected and intimate it made the hairs on her arms stand up. "Of course you should have," he said, his tone shifting, losing its teasing edge and becoming something deeper, more serious. "Hesitation would have been a far greater crime than anything you were accused of today." There was a pause, a beat of silence, where she could hear the faint, muffled sounds of the city on his end of the line, a distant siren, the low hum of traffic. He was somewhere else living his life, and she had just breached the wall of it with this call. "I'm at the Sovereign," the bar on the top floor. "Meet me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons, delivered with the same quiet, unshakable authority with which he had run his courtroom. And then, before she could reply, before her rational mind could even begin to formulate a protest, he hung up. The line went dead, leaving only the soft electronic hum of the disconnected call. Audrey stared at her phone, her knuckles white where she gripped it. The Sovereign. It was one of the most exclusive old-money establishments in the city, a place where deals were made in hushed tones over $100 glasses of scotch. A place where a federal judge could go and be assured of his privacy. She should say no. She should delete his number, throw the card away, and bury the memory of him so deep it would never surface again. It was the smart move, the safe move. 10 minutes later, she was in the back of a taxi, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had told no one where she was going. Her briefcase, with the now irrelevant files for the Sterling versus Thorne case, sat forgotten on her office floor. As the cab sped through the glittering, rain-slicked streets, she felt like she was shedding her own life, leaving behind the carefully constructed identity of Audrey Sinclair, Esquire, and racing toward an unknown, dangerous, and utterly irresistible new reality. The bar at the Sovereign was a masterpiece of understated opulence, dark wood, supple leather, and the soft golden glow of low lighting. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city's sparkling skyline, the lights like a carpet of scattered diamonds. The air was quiet, filled with the respectful murmur of quiet conversations and the soft clink of ice in heavy crystal glasses. It was a world away from the harsh reality of the courthouse, a sanctuary of power and privilege. She saw him immediately. He wasn't at a crowded table. He was in a secluded corner booth, a leather-bound alcove that afforded him a view of the entire room while keeping him cloaked in shadow. He was alone, a single glass of amber liquid on the table before him. He was no longer in his suit. He wore a simple dark cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. The casual attire, the absence of the armor of his suit and robes, made him seem both more approachable and infinitely more dangerous. He wasn't playing a role now. This was him. He must have felt her presence because he lifted his head and his eyes found hers across the crowded room. The connection was instantaneous, a physical jolt that seemed to suck the air from her lungs. The low hum of the bar, the glittering city lights, everything faded into the background. There was only the magnetic, undeniable pull between them. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. He didn't wave or beckon. He simply watched her, his gaze an invisible thread reeling her in. Her legs felt unsteady as she navigated the maze of tables, every eye in the room seeming to follow her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, an intruder in this world that was so clearly his. She slid into the leather booth opposite him, the supple material cool against her skin. "Counselor," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur that was for her alone. "You came." "You didn't exactly give me a choice," she retorted, finding a sliver of her old defiance. "There's always a choice," he countered, his blue eyes glinting in the dim light. "You chose to be here, just as you chose to argue your case the way you did this morning." He leaned forward slightly, the golden light catching the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face. Tell me, Audrey, what verdict were you hoping for? The question hung between them, layered with meaning. He wasn't just talking about the case. He was asking what she wanted from him from this. Before she could answer, a waiter appeared at their table, a silent, discreet ghost. Alistair didn't look away from her. "Bring her the same," he said to the waiter, a soft command that dismissed the man before he had even fully arrived. He knew what she drank, or he was simply deciding for her. Either way, the gesture was one of profound, effortless intimacy. "I don't know," she finally answered, her voice a low, honest whisper. The confession felt like a surrender. "I don't know what I want, don't you?" he challenged softly. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His fingers were long and warm, his touch sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity up her arm. It wasn't a tentative gesture. It was a claiming. "I want what I want," he murmured, his thumb beginning to draw slow, hypnotic circles on the back of her hand. "Do you want to see what happens when we stop fighting this? You want to know if the fire that we seem to start whenever we're in the same room is going to warm us or burn us both to the ground?" She couldn't speak. She could only watch, mesmerized, as his thumb continued its seductive, maddening caress. He was reading her mind, speaking the reckless, terrifying thoughts she hadn't dared to form herself. The waiter returned with her drink, placing it on the table with a soft, reverent click before disappearing again. Alistair released her hand, the loss of his touch a sudden, sharp ache. He leaned back into the shadows of the booth, creating a space between them once more, watching her, waiting. He was giving her back the control she thought she had lost. She picked up the heavy crystal glass, the cool weight of it a welcome anchor in the swirling sea of her senses. She took a sip of the whiskey. It was smoky, complex, and incredibly smooth, the taste of expensive, quiet power. It tasted like him. The liquid fire slid down her throat, bolstering her courage. She placed the glass back on the table and met his gaze, her own eyes now holding a new, bold resolve. The internal trial was over. The verdict was in. "You're right," she said, her voice clear and steady. "That is what I want." A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. It was not the arrogant smirk from the library, or the amused glint from the bench. It was a genuine, devastatingly attractive smile of pure, unadulterated victory. It was the smile of a man who had laid a perfect trap and was now watching with immense satisfaction as his quarry willingly walked right into it. "Good," he said, his voice a deep, resonant purr. He lifted his own glass in a silent toast. "Because the hearing is over. And now, counselor, the private negotiation can begin." 2 weeks. 14 days had passed since Audrey had walked out of Alistair's chambers, with his private number burning a hole in her pocket. 14 days that had felt like both a lifetime and the blink of an eye. The world she had known, a world governed by statutes and strategies, had been completely and irrevocably upended. Her life was now cleaved in two, the bright, orderly public world of Audrey Sinclair, the brilliant lawyer whose case had been anticlimactically reassigned to a different, much older and far less interesting judge, and the secret, shadowy, intoxicating world that existed only within the confines of Alistair Blackwood's penthouse apartment. She was there now, curled into the corner of a sprawling charcoal-grey sofa that felt softer than a cloud. A half-empty glass of deep blood-red wine rested on the marble coaster beside her. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittered below, a silent, beautiful beast that felt 1,000,000 miles away. This apartment, his sanctuary, was a reflection of him, minimalist, masculine, and exuding a quiet, terrifying power. There were no photographs, no clutter, just clean lines, expensive art that was more texture than image, and the ever-present scent of old books, sandalwood and him. He was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the diamond-dusted skyline, speaking on the phone. His voice was the low, authoritative rumble she recognized from the bench, a voice discussing mergers and jurisdictions, a voice from his other life. But even from across the room, she could feel the invisible thread that connected them. He wasn't just a powerful judge anymore. He was the man who knew the exact spot behind her ear that made her shiver. He was the man whose breathing in the dark had become the most comforting sound she had ever known. This secret life was an addiction. It was stolen evenings like this, where the world was shut out by thick glass and the soft click of a lock. It was the thrill of arriving in a separate car, taking a private elevator, knowing that their being together was a profound and dangerous transgression. The risk, the sheer beautiful recklessness of it all, was a potent aphrodisiac that made every touch, every shared glance, every whispered secret feel more vital, more real, than anything she had ever known. He finished his call with a clipped final-sounding phrase and turned. The hard judicial lines of his face softened the moment his eyes landed on her. A slow, possessive smile, a smile that was hers and hers alone, touched his lips. He crossed the room in a few long, silent strides and sat beside her on the sofa. The cushion dipped with his weight, and her body instinctively tilted toward his gravitational pull. "Done playing God for the night?" she teased, her voice a low, husky sound she barely recognized as her own. "My authority ends at the door to this apartment," he murmured, his voice a deep purr. He took the wineglass from her hand and set it aside, his intentions clear. "In here," his hand came to rest on her hip, his fingers splaying possessively over the silk of her blouse. "There is a different kind of law." His thumb brushed back and forth, a small, hypnotic motion that sent a wave of liquid heat through her. She leaned into him, her head finding the natural curve of his shoulder. The rough texture of his cashmere sweater was a delightful friction against her cheek. She closed her eyes, inhaling his scent, letting the solid, steady beat of his heart against her ear anchor her. This was peace, a dangerous, fragile, and utterly perfect peace. It was shattered by a vibration. Her phone, lying face down on the marble end table, buzzed against the stone. The sound, so mundane and ordinary, was a violent intrusion into their secluded world. It was a stark reminder that the city below, with all its rules and risks, was still there, still waiting for them. "Let it be," Alistair murmured, his lips brushing against her hair. His hand on her hip tightened, a silent command for her to stay, to ignore the world outside. "It might be my office," she whispered, a reluctant pull of duty. The Sterling versus Thorne case was still her responsibility, even with the new judge. Just a second. The look of irritation that flickered across his face was possessive and deeply satisfying. With a reluctant sigh, she disentangled herself from him, the loss of his warmth immediate and acute. She picked up the phone. It was a text from her junior associate, Ben. Her brow furrowed. Ben knew she was offline for the evening. It had to be important. She opened the message. Her blood ran cold. The words on the screen seemed to glow with a malevolent light. She read them once, then twice, her mind struggling to process the implications. It was a string of frantic, abbreviated legal speak. "Thorne is on the warpath. Filed a motion to contest your firm's dismissal request." But that's not the real issue. He's also filed a discovery request demanding Judge Blackwood's official reasons for recusal, citing potential for judicial impropriety, influencing the case's initial trajectory. He's not just fighting the case, Audrey. He's investigating the judge. A shard of ice slid into her stomach. The beautiful, glittering view from the window suddenly felt menacing. The 1,000 lights of the city becoming 1,000 prying eyes. He's investigating the judge. The phrase was a death knell. Marcus wasn't just a sore loser. He was a shark who had smelled a single drop of blood in the water, and now he was circling, searching for the source of the wound. "What is it?" Alistair's voice was sharp, cutting through her panicked haze. He had seen the color drain from her face, the way her hand trembled as she held the phone. "Audrey, what's wrong?" She couldn't speak. She simply handed him the phone. He took it, his eyes quickly scanning the text. She watched his face, searching for a reaction. What she saw was terrifying. The lover, the passionate, unguarded man who had been beside her on the sofa, vanished. In his place, the judge returned. A chilling stillness came over him, the predatory calm she had seen on the bench. His face became an unreadable mask of stone, but she saw the muscles in his jaw bunch, a hard knot of controlled fury. The air in the room grew heavy, cold. He handed the phone back to her, his movements precise and economical. "A predictable if pathetic move from a desperate man," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. But it was a lie. His stillness was not calm. It was the unnerving quiet of a predator gathering itself before a strike. "Alistair, this is my fault," she whispered, the words tasting like poison. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. He saw something in the courtroom, our dynamic. "I pushed too hard. I gave him a reason to be suspicious. I put a target on your back." He turned to her, and his eyes were chips of blue ice. "Do not," he said, his voice a low, dangerous command. Ever blame yourself for the actions of a snake like Marcus Thorne? He is a bitter, ambitious bottom feeder who cannot stand that a woman half his age is twice the lawyer he will ever be. He would have found a way to attack you regardless. This is just his new weapon. He began to pace, a caged tiger in his own luxurious prison. This isn't about the law. This is about ego. He's not trying to win the case anymore. He's trying to wound me. He's gambling that the threat of a formal inquiry will be enough to make the court pressure your firm into a settlement, to make this all go away. Will it work? She asked, her voice small. He stopped pacing and looked at her, a dark, humorless smile on his lips. It would work on a judge with something to hide. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The motion will be denied. A judge's reasons for recusal are privileged. He knows this. It is a shot in the dark. A nuisance, but they both knew it was more than that. It was a signal. It was Marcus Thorne announcing that he was now hunting them. The sanctuary of this apartment, their secret world, had been breached. The danger was no longer a hypothetical risk. It had a name. Alistair came to her, pulling her up from the sofa and into his arms. His embrace was different now. It was no longer just passionate. It was fierce, possessive, protective. He held her as if he could shield her from the world with his own body. "This changes nothing between us," he murmured into her hair, his voice a raw, determined growl. "Let him dig. He will find nothing. We will be more careful. That's all." But as he tilted her chin up and his mouth found hers, the kiss was different. The slow, seductive burn was gone, replaced by a desperate, almost violent intensity. It was a kiss of defiance, a claiming in the face of a new threat. It was a sealing of their conspiracy, a silent vow that they were in this together. And as she kissed him back, surrendering to the storm, a single terrifying thought echoed in Audrey's mind. This wasn't just desire anymore. This was a rebellion, and Marcus Thorne had just declared war on them both. The shadow of Marcus Thorne's threat, instead of pushing them apart, fused them together. The danger was a crucible, burning away any remaining hesitation, any lingering doubt. Their stolen moments became more precious, their passion more desperate. The quiet, luxurious sanctuary of Alistair's penthouse was no longer just a meeting place. It was a fortress, a bastion against the war Thorne was trying to wage on their world. Every kiss was an act of defiance. Every touch was a silent vow of loyalty. Tonight, the storm outside mimicked the tempest in their hearts. Rain lashed against the vast windows, the wind howling a mournful song. But inside, there was only a fierce, consuming heat. Audrey was pressed against the cool glass of the window. The city lights a blurred watercolor painting behind the rain-streaked pane. Alistair stood before her, his hands tangled in her hair, his mouth a searing brand on hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a raw, hungry claiming, a desperate attempt to erase the outside world, to erase the name Marcus Thorne, to erase everything but the undeniable, explosive truth of them. "I can't think when I'm with you," he growled against her lips, his voice a rough, ragged sound of a man who had lost a war with himself and was glorious in his defeat. All the logic, all the rules, they just turned to smoke. "Then don't think," she whispered back, her own hands sliding under his sweater, her palms flat against the hard, warm muscle of his back. "Just feel." He pulled her away from the window, leading her wordlessly toward the bedroom. The air was thick with unspoken promises, with a desire so potent it was a physical presence in the room. This was more than an affair. It was a conspiracy of two souls, a secret language spoken in touches and whispers. He was the judge, the man of rules, and she was the only one who had ever made him want to break them. He laid her down on the bed, the Egyptian cotton sheets impossibly soft against her skin. He loomed over her, a dark, powerful silhouette against the dim light from the living room. His eyes, burning with a possessive, almost feral intensity, never left hers. He lowered his head, his lips finding the sensitive skin of her neck, and a shudder of pure, exquisite pleasure racked her body. In this room, with his touch, she felt invincible. Marcus Thorne and his pathetic motions were a distant echo, a problem for another day. For the lawyers, they were in the daylight. Tonight, they were just a man and a woman, surrendering to a force more powerful than any law. And then, a sound. A sharp, authoritative buzz that sliced through the intimate silence. It wasn't a phone, it wasn't the television. It was the intercom for the private elevator, the one that opened directly into the penthouse foyer. Alistair froze, his body going rigid above her. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a confusion that quickly hardened into disbelief. Audrey's heart stopped. No one came here. Ever. The doorman had a strict, unbreakable list of approved names, a list that contained exactly 0 people. The buzzing came again, longer this time, more insistent. An impatient, demanding sound, a cold, visceral dread, sharper and more terrifying than anything she had ever felt, seized Audrey. She sat up, clutching the sheets to her chest. "Who is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Alistair didn't answer. A muscle feathered in his jaw as he stared at the bedroom door, his mind clearly racing through 1,000 impossible scenarios. He slid off the bed, his movements sharp and silent, every trace of the lover gone, replaced by the formidable, calculating judge. He grabbed his sweater from the floor where it had been discarded. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl she barely recognized. "Don't make a sound." He walked out of the bedroom, leaving her alone in the sudden, terrifying silence, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear his footsteps on the hardwood floor of the living area, then the soft beep of the intercom panel, a beat of silence. And then she heard his voice, tight with a controlled fury she had never heard before. "What the hell are you doing? Here?" Audrey held her breath, straining to hear the reply, a tinny, distorted voice coming through the speaker. But she didn't need to, because a moment later, she heard the soft, deadly chime of the private elevator arriving. She heard the metallic slide of the doors opening, and then she heard a new voice in the apartment. A voice she knew. A voice that haunted her waking moments and fueled her nightmares. A smarmy, triumphant voice that had absolutely no business being in this sanctuary. "Hello, Alistair," said Marcus Thorne. "I just thought it was time we had a chat about your conflict of interest." The enemy is inside the fortress. The secret is on the brink of being exposed, and the game has just become deadly. What does Marcus know? And how far will he go to destroy them both? The verdict is coming. If you need to see what happens next in this story of forbidden passion and high-stakes danger, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on all notifications. And tell me in the comments below, what would you do if you were Audrey? Hide or fight? Your answer might just predict what happens next. Don't miss it.